All right, back with another reading hour live stream for May 28th, 2025. So yesterday we left off on the Gladio book at the Fort Hunt conference. Sorry, starting off strong here. All right, so the worst fears of Allen Dulles for the post-war period began to materialize in February 1945, when the leaders of the Big Three, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, met at Yalta on the Black Sea to redraw the map of Europe. The eastern border of Germany was moved westward to the Oder and Neisse rivers, and parts of eastern Poland were handed over to the Soviets. What remained of Germany was to be divided into 4 zones of occupation, which would be administered by a council of military generals, including the French. Sorry. As soon as the ink dried on the Yalta Agreement, Dulles transported Galen and his top representatives to Fort Hunt, Virginia, where they were wined and dined by Donovan and other U.S. officials. Okay, so in case you weren't here yesterday, you don't remember, one of the things we left off talking about was how the leaders of these various countries who were ending World War II, defeating the Nazis, met up to decide how that ending and post war partitions would go. This is part of that Yalta conference. And Stalin had suspicions and was told that the others were conspiring to work against the Soviets and with the Nazis. And when he brought this up, Winston Churchill gaslit him, acted like he was crazy. But we find out now that this was, of course, all true. So let me see if I can get the chat. Look at the chat here. All right, let's see. Uh, so back to the book here. An agreement was reached. Galen would reach Galen would return to Germany under U.S. protection to establish the Galen Organization, which would receive full funding from U.S. Army G2 intelligence unit resources. The primary purpose of this organization would be the maintenance of the existing stay-behind armies and the recruitment of new guerrilla soldiers from the ranks of the Third Reich veterans with staunch anti-communist credentials. So, of course, they're looking for the most ardent and dedicated fascists, and those are the people who are the most anti-communist. It's not a coincidence. These soldiers would no longer be known as werewolves. They were to be known as gladiators, and they would be commissioned to ward off communist invaders in the great theater of post-war Europe. The operation in which they were engaged was to be known as gladio, after the short swords Roman gladiators used to kill their opponents. Interesting. And I remember looking up some kind of Italian knife. Oh, it's a stiletto. And if you look it up, it looks like one of the knives that's like featured in various fascist logos. Uh, it's a very like just a very pointy. Not that knives are not usually pointy, but even the sides and the parts that don't need to be sharp are sharp. Very angular. So poetry and paranoia. Dulles was not the only OSS official involved in establishing stay-behind units. He was aided by James Jesus Angleton, one of the strangest spooks to emerge from the shadow world of the U.S. intelligence community. James Jesus Angleton is another just like infamous figure in this era of CIA and U.S. intelligence operations. Another figure that is talked about a lot on what's it called, the American Exception podcast with Aaron Good. A tall figure of spectral thinness with owlish glasses, Angleton was a rabid anti-communist, an ardent Anglophile, and a devout Roman Catholic. Man, does that sound like a lot of young, edgy Gen Z kids nowadays? Sorry. He bred orchids. Another Twitter account I like is Angleton Orchids. Definitely give them a follow. He bred orchids, wore a black Homburg, which is that nerdy looking kind of hat, and drank bourbon for breakfast. Very healthy. A graduate of Yale, Angleton possessed a gift for poetry and had established close friendships with Ezra Pound, E. E. Cummings, and T.S. Eliot. Fluent in several languages, including German and Italian, he arrived in Rome as the commander of the Secret Counterintelligence (SCI) unit of the OSS. Few were more qualified for the position. Unfortunately, Angleton was not only brilliant, but also dangerously paranoid, seeing the world as a quote, wilderness of mirrors. In these mirrors, he saw reflections of spies and counter spies, many of whom he felt compelled to eliminate, and the unfolding succession of conspiracy upon conspiracy, all of which required immediate and at times murderous resolution. Angleton's father, Hugh, also served the OSS. So, yeah, we can see it runs in the family, and Yeah, just the idea of this man being so paranoid and having this much power. Like he had legitimate, uh, like a lot of power, and he wielded it. Like we will find out all the things that he did, but he's responsible for lots of murders. Um, yeah, and to think that like someone like this is just waking up, drinking bourbon for breakfast, and is plagued by this like paranoid conspiratorial mind. So back to his father. Before the war, Hugh had been the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Italy and owner of the Milan branch of the National Cash Register Company. The elder Angleton, who was outspokenly pro Hitler and pro Mussolini, had developed extensive contacts throughout Italy that were of great use to his son. One such contact was Prince Junio Valerio Borghese, a member of the Catholic black nobility, the Italian aristocrats who had remained loyal to the Holy See after the rise of Garibaldi in the 19th century. So this is some history that's going back quite a bit. I'm not very familiar with any of this, but so this section Black Xmas or Black Christmas. Borghese was the leader of Decima Flotilla, MAS, or the 10-inch light flotilla. I guess that's some kind of regiment, also known as Ex-Mas, an Italian naval commando unit. Okay, there you go. After Italy signed an armistice with the Allies on September 8th, 1943, Borghese and his commandos opted to fight for the so-called, quote, Solo Republic that had been set up by the Nazis in northern Italy. His unit was given the task of attacking the Italian partisan bands that had sprouted up throughout Italy. The partisans were sponsored by the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, and thanks to Ex-Mas, thousands were found hanging from streetlights and flagpoles by the end of the war. So yeah, this is how fascists conduct their operations. Um, they just do things. And those things are often very murderous. They go after the most marginalized people, and they usually get away with it because the state doesn't mind if people do that. The state does not mind fascism. The state only minds if you go after people who are influential, who have power, who have money, the capitalists. On April 13th, 1945, Borghese met with General Wolfe and Angleton at a villa on Garda Lake where they discussed the possibility of extending their war efforts beyond any peace treaty with the Soviets, redeploying ex-Mas under the covert direction of the OSS. So you can see they already have this militia of like really ardent or anti-communists, the most dedicated fascists, like I was saying, and the first thing that they think to use them for is to clandestinely murder communists, just activists, like people who are just politically active, not even militants. So Borghese was amenable to the terms, especially since his cooperation would save him from an Italian firing squad. And now the section called The Secret Government. On May 15th, 1945, when Borghese was arrested and charged with war crimes, Angleton managed to secure his release into U.S. Army custody. The Black Prince was dressed in an American uniform and transported from Milan to Rome. So yeah, this is like one of the main ideas of what's happening here is U.S. officials, U.S. intelligence people, using the military and government, whatever means are at their disposal, to shield Nazis, like some of the worst and highest, most powerful Nazis, from any kind of accountability whatsoever, so that they can use them for their own anti-communist operations. Angleton needed Borghese and the 10,267 fascists who fought under his command to help establish the stay-behind units that would ward off any Soviet aggression. For a while, Angleton and other OSS officials, including Donovan, toyed with the idea of making Borghese the new king of Italy, but soon they came to their senses and realized that the ex-Mas commander would be of greater use as the leader of a shadow government, with a secret army that could manipulate Italian affairs throughout the coming decades. So yeah, why bother having like the official government if you can have just a secret one and get just as much done, if not more? To create this government, the U.S. State Department issued a mandate by which the quote operational resources of the Italian police, the Italian military intelligence, and the Italian Secret Service were placed at the disposal of Angleton and the oh, it just cuts off here, so I guess some kind of typo. So I'm going to say I'm going to guess it's Angleton and the OSS. Oh no, sorry, the SCI is just down here. Under Borghese, the Gladio forces in Italy were divided into 40 main groups, 10 specialized in sabotage, 6 each in espionage, propaganda, and escape tactics, and 12 in guerrilla activities. So yeah, very organized, very well what do you call it? Delegated. They have all their things. They got all their ducks in a row. A special training camp for members of the stay behind units was set up in Sardinia, off of Italy's western coast. The camp, thanks to the efforts of Galen and Wolfe, was soon swarming with new gladiators from Germany, France, and Austria. By 1946, when the OSS morphed into the Central Intelligence Group, the precursor of the CIA, hundreds of Gladio units were placed throughout Western Europe. Okay, so this is actually, ironically, what vanguardism kind of looks like. I've been thinking a lot about, I've obviously been talking a lot about vanguard parties and what they look like, how they actually operate. In our series on South Africa, we talked about how a lot of times they have to operate outside of the country. Like the vanguard parties are obviously not doing things that are legal. So often, just the org itself, like being a member, is illegal. So you have to operate from outside of the country. And now here you have an example of fascists adopting vanguard tactics. Like they're creating these militias, having them trained outside of the country or somewhere that is within the country, but uh, what do you call it? Like obscure enough that no one's going to see it or notice them. And that's also kind of what a lot of fascists in the US have done. I remember there was a lot of stories since 2016, before Ukraine became like the cause celeb that Americans had to support. There was a lot of talk of Americans going over to Ukraine to train with fascist militias. They had all the different names for them. They were also doing this out in like the deep woods of Montana or somewhere else on the West Coast. Like Northern California is notorious for having a lot of fascists and militias. So again, this is all what vanguard parties actually look like. It's just there's none on the left, which is why I keep saying it's totally safe to talk about them and just state that fact because that's how far behind the so-called left is in the West. Um, it's not dangerous to talk about it because the fascists have firmly entrenched their system and crushed the left in the West. It does not exist. But anyway, back to the book here. A special training camp. Okay, I read that one already. So now this is the section called the money supply. But there was still a problem that seemed insurmountable. Gladio was a covert operation and had not been initiated by an act of Congress or a mandate from the Pentagon. Few federal officials knew of its existence. The $200 million in original funding came from the Rockefeller and Mellon foundations. I believe those are both still around, right? Wonder what they're up to now. But apparently this wasn't enough money, so. But a new and steady stream of revenue had to be created almost overnight, or the world would not be safe for democracy. The future of Gladio would come to reside within America's ghettos. Yeah, so this is where it takes a very interesting turn. That's the end of chapter 1 right here. But in case you don't know or can't see this coming, it's heroin. Spoiler alert, it's heroin. The CIA traffics and sells heroin in the inner city to fund their illegal fascist operations around the world. That's basically what the main idea is here. So, chapter 2, The Lucky Break, Negroes and Narcotics. What cannot now be denied is that U.S. intelligence agencies arranged for the release from prison of the world's preeminent drug lord, allowed him to rebuild his narcotics empire, watched the flow of drugs into the largely black ghettos of New York and Washington D.C., escalate, and then lied about what they had done. I'm going to read that again because uh, he does that a lot. He will just like drop bombs in the form of these like long sentences. Um, what cannot now be denied is that U.S. intelligence agencies arranged for the release from prison of the world's preeminent drug lord, allowed him to rebuild his narcotics empire, watched the flow of drugs into the largely black ghettos of New York and Washington D.C., escalate, and then lied about what they had done. This founding saga of the relationship between American spies and gangsters set patterns that would be replicated from Laos and Burma to Marseille and Panama. Alexander Coburn and Jeffrey St. Clair, in the book Whiteout, The CIA, Drugs, and the Press, Colonel Paul E. Hellawell had one hell of an idea. It came to him in China, where he was serving as the chief of special intelligence for the OSS. So this guy is like a notorious character in this saga. He's going to be involved with Chiang Kai shek in Taiwan. And yeah, he's going to be a huge part of the reason why that's still uh, claiming to be some kind of separate country from China, even though it's not internationally recognized. I always use the analogy of imagine if when the Confederates had lost the Civil War, if they had found some kind of enclave or island that they could flee to and try to defend themselves. And they did that for like, I don't know, several decades after the war was over. Would that make them any more legitimate? Would that make them a legitimate country that has a right to exist, quote unquote? It would not. So Taiwan is the same situation. So back to this General Hellowell. Hellowell's idea would result in a union between the U.S. intelligence community and organized crime that would result in conflicts, wars, rebellions, financial upheavals, and an epidemic that would forever alter the flow of world history. Mainstream books about the CIA, like Tim Weiner's Legacy of Ashes, make no mention of Hellowell, his relationship with Lucky Luciano and Meyer Lansky, his creation of the Castle Bank in the Bahamas, and his grand experiment on the black community of Harlem. Yeah, so it gets pretty interesting here, but I'm at 20 minutes for this book, so I'm going to bookmark it here and we'll pick up on that book tomorrow. And now I'm going to switch over to the Western Marxism book. Let's see how far I got yesterday. Okay, so now we're on Western Marxism and the Politics of Defeat. So I believe we're through the intro now. Despair is typical of those who do not understand the causes of evil, see no way out, and are incapable of struggle. To quote from Lenin. This book is a rejoinder to Perry Anderson's Considerations on Western Marxism, 1976. So I guess this must still be part of the introduction. The latter's Trotskyist assessment, written in dialogue with the editorial staff of the New Left Review, identifies some key aspects of Western Marxism. However, it is simultaneously symptomatic of many of the problems that Lacerda highlights in this tradition, including its patronizing Eurocentrism, sorry, its patronizing Eurocentrism, idealism, and complicity with imperialism. I mean, that nails it. Those are the three main characteristics of Western Marxism, right there. Anderson's understanding of Western Marxism, in which he bizarrely includes Communist Party militants Georgy Lukács and Antonio Gramsci, is that it is a quote product of defeat. That also makes sense. Extended quote here: "The failure of the socialist revolution to spread outside Russia, cause and consequence of corruption inside Russia, is the common background to the entire theoretical tradition of this period." Hmm, interesting. This purported failure contributed to Western Marxists' withdrawal from parties and into the academy, their shift away from political and economic issues in favor of philosophic and aesthetic concerns, and their injection of pre and extra Marxist theoretical elements into historical materialism. Yeah, there's a lot there. Very, very interesting. I'm just going to read that last part again. This purported failure contributed to Western Marxists' withdrawal from parties and into the academy, their shift away from political and economic issues in favor of philosophic and aesthetic concerns, and their injection of pre and extra Marxist theoretical elements into historical materialism. And that's something I've recognized a lot is like after the collapse of the Soviet Union, for like the entire 90s, it was just the norm to say that socialism or communism failed, that it can't work, that it sounds good on paper, all the cliches that people have been saying and still say now because they're stuck in that mindset. They're not recognizing the accomplishments of existing socialist countries today. Um, Yeah, it caused people to had also blamed the student movement, which is around the 70s. It seemed like that was a big turning point for Marxism to go from being something that people practiced in like a militant way to something that people studied and debated and talked about. It became like an academic thing. Anyway, I'll get back to the book here. So Uh, oh, and also the part of injecting pre and extra Marxist theoretical elements. I love that too because that is a defining characteristic of the Western Marxist and the Western left is having these ideas that feel good but are not rooted in any sense of historical materialism. They're not actually Marxist. They're just things that people intuitively think, and then they insist that these are like Marxist ideas or traditions or something. But anyway. At the same time, Anderson asserts that the quote, Stalinization of the communist movement transformed the USSR into a quote, semi literate backwater and led to a quote, overall weakness of socialist culture, whereas quote, major sectors of bourgeois thought regained a relative vitality and superiority over socialist thought. Yeah, I mean, it for the longest time, for most of my life at least, to be a socialist in the US, in the West, to call yourself that, to identify as one, first of all, usually comes along with no meaningful praxis because it would be quite literally illegal, and that you would have the feds after you if you tried to actually exercise socialism or communism in the West. But also, it was just a guaranteed way to not get taken seriously, and it's still going to take, I'm sure, several more years before people start taking socialism more seriously. They're just starting to wake up now to how much China is kicking the US's ass, but it's going to take several more years of that happening before people really get it through their heads. In this regard, he repeatedly celebrates the quote, radical novelty of the Western Marxists, who indulge in bourgeois culture while abandoning praxis, producing theories that have little to no use value for the struggles of the working and oppressed masses. Another thing I love about the Western left is like the endless debating about what your theoretical socialist perfect society utopia is going to look like, while doing absolutely nothing to even mildly dent the capitalism that you're living under and that is oppressing you and preventing you from having anything like that. In perfect line with the precepts of bourgeois culture, and as an apparent rebuttal to the Marxist position that the validity of any claim depends on the primary primacy of practice. Man, that's a tough one. Let me just take it over again. In perfect line with the precepts of bourgeois culture, and as an apparent rebuttal to the Marxist position that the validity of any claim depends on the primacy of practice, Anderson insists that, quote, the pertinent criterion here is not the validity of these innovations or their compatibility with the basic principles of Marxism, it is their originality. And that's also something I've noticed as well. It's like the individualism has poisoned any ideas people have about Marxism or what it's supposed to be. And so they just flock to anyone who comes up with a new idea, whether or not that idea is good, let alone proven by any kind of practice. Drawing on the historical experience of Europe, which he describes as, quote, in certain critical respects the most advanced in the world, end quote. Anderson goes on to assert that the innovative spirit of Western Marxism has been able to achieve, quote, a sophistication greater than that of any previous phase of historical materialism. I mean, I guess, uh, I don't know if that's meant to be some kind of like sarcastic take on it, but how sophisticated is it if it's not actually able to accomplish anything? Or is that some kind of dig on the Western Marxists saying that they are sophisticated but impotent, whereas the Eastern Marxists are crude and rudimentary but much more effective? That's my interpretation, at least. Anderson's work was published by New Left Books, later renamed Verso Books, only a year after the Vietnamese people under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, had handed a spectacular defeat to the most powerful imperialist army in the world. However, there was no reference to it in quote Ho Chi Minh thought, and little to no discussion of Vietnam or other socialist revolutions, aside from the peremptory assertion that they have failed to construct socialism. Okay, so never mind. That book is interpreting everything from literally the 90s anti socialist mainstream view. Odd. Lest we forget, which would be easy to do when reading Anderson's book, the socialist world actually witnessed a massive expansion between the Second World War and mid 1970s. Eastern Europe, liberated from fascism and authoritarian regimes, was integrated into the socialist camp, and revolutionary governments took power in Korea and Vietnam, both of which were drawn out processes due to brutal imperialist interventions. Yeah, I mean, it's only now that people are starting to recognize that North Korea is still, what do you call it, like under occupation by the US. Like it's still, the hostile relations are not because of North Korea, they are because of the US. And it's starting to become somewhat more of a mainstream view in the West, but nowhere near as widely recognized as it should be, considering it's just the basic facts of the situation. After the Chinese Revolution of 1949 and China's formal alliance with the USSR in 1950, approximately one third of the world's population was living in socialist countries. This trend continued, in fits and starts, through the following 3 decades as there was a veritable global surge in socialist revolutions and national liberation struggles, from Cuba to Guinea-Bissau and beyond. This was the precise period during which Anderson penned his Jeremiad on political defeat. It is important to add, moreover, that these socialist advances also contributed both to both social welfare compromises and a relative strengthening of revolutionary socialism within the capitalist core. This is easily visible when compared to the subsequent era of counter revolutionary revanchism known as neoliberalism. So, yeah, I love that. Another very succinct and well put way to describe those several decades. Like, that's easily like a 60 to 70-year span he's describing. And that's the best comparison you could make. There was an era of actually having militant movements in the West that went along with them being able to demand social benefits from the state, even the capitalist one. And then once the existing socialist countries dwindled, that pressure was no longer there. The supposed defeat that is the hallmark of Western Marxism, according to Anderson, actually only applies to Europe and more precisely, Western Europe. Moreover, it only really means that communists did not succeed in seizing state power in the West, as they nonetheless exercised significant political, economic, and cultural influence. Mhm. Yeah, so just reiterating what we were just saying. From the point of view of the global working class, this period was one of major advances and some remarkable victories, including the incredible rout of fascism, the global weakening of imperialism through successful anti colonial struggles, and the imposition of democratic reforms and social welfare provisions in the West. So, yeah, the good old days, as people call it. Still lots of racism, still lots of obvious cultural issues, but there was at least some kind of economic reforms that people enjoyed. From Anderson's vantage point as a prominent theorist in the imperial core, these achievements were apparently of little import, presumably because they did not bring about theoretical innovations of the sort cherished by intellectuals of his ilk. With the exception of the early Lenin, read as a progenitor of Trotsky, Anderson suggests that Eastern Marxists did not make any major theoretical contributions. Hell of a claim. Wow. But that's typical. That's like the typical bravado of some people living in the West not building socialism to criticize people who are doing a better job of it. The fact that they actually made revolutions, mobilizing theoretical and practical knowledge to raise millions of people out of abject conditions of slavery, exploitation, and oppression, pales in comparison to the intellectual novelties of Western theorists promoted as major commodity producers by Anderson's publication platforms. Okay, that's probably one of the most sarcastic sentences I've read in here so far, and I love it. From the perspective of this grandee of the Western theory industry, it appears that the exchange value of Marxist theory, which is augmented by novelty and originality, is more important than its use value for human liberation. Man, just rolling, yeah, just equally sarcastic. This is like such subtle fire, very sardonic. These positions are typical of Western Marxism, as it is understood and analyzed by Lacerdo. Anderson's book is, in fact, a repository for many of its major themes: idealism and the primacy of theory, Eurocentric social chauvinism in the sense of an attitude of patronizing cultural superiority, and the dogmatic rejection of actually existing socialism, a politics of defeat based on historical misrepresentations, a willful dilution of Marxism with bourgeois theory and petty bourgeois theoretical practices, a celebration of marketable novelty at the expense of practical relevance, and self promotional opportunism that perpetuates cultural imperialism and disdain for Marxism in the global South. God damn. He's just like listing off all the bad things that Western quote unquote Marxists do that cause them to fail over and over again. This is like, yeah, this is pretty crushing. So many things. It's just like a bullet point list. In the postscript to his 1983 quasi sequel to Considerations on Western Marxism, Anderson laid his cards on the table by peremptorily de- peremptorily asserting that socialism did not exist anywhere in the world. So yeah, he's just got the basic like left com opinion. That's like literally what they all say. Uh, left coms are ultra leftists, the people who are, yeah, it's basically Trotskyists, any of the people who criticize socialism from a theoretical perspective, and they say things like socialism has never truly existed. It's like it existed. It may not have been perfect. You may not be a fan of it, but people were making their best attempt at it, and it's all we have. In the postscript to his 1983, so I read that already. Okay, so it didn't exist. It did not exist anywhere in the world, but that it should nonetheless remain an object of theoretical debate. Ironically, this was the same year as the socialist revolution in Burkina Faso, led by Thomas Sankara. Yeah, who was like a hero, who literally materially improved the lives of so many of his people in ways that like other people can only imagine. Like, just look up the accomplishments of Thomas Sankara sometime. They call him the vaccination king for how many children he was able to save from preventable diseases. The reason for this is because of the purported need for a third way, meaning, quote, a social order beyond both capital and bureaucracy, i.e., actually existing socialism. The closest he comes to describing this anti socialist intellectual orientation is by claiming that a, quote, open and inventive Marxism should simply no longer be Marxist, but instead, quote, find its province in a flexible balance between anarchism and Fabianism. What the fuck is Fabianism? Look that up. Fabian Society is a British socialist organization whose purpose is to advance the principles of social democracy and democratic socialism via gradualist and reformist effort in democracies rather than by revolutionary overthrow. Okay, so yeah, just basic social democracy, reformist crap. Let's see. Oh no, third way politics. Third way politics of this sort has regularly been criticized by Marxists, who have identified it as an expression of a petty bourgeois class position, particularly within the imperialist core. Yeah, it's long been my position that people who are anarchists, social democrats, democratic socialists, any of the people who are reformists or gradualists who are participating in electoralism and call themselves socialists or leftists in any way, those people are not socialists. They do not want to overturn capitalism. They do not want to really even put a dent in it. They just want to be petty bouge. Those people should get better jobs and should stop participating in politics. Nikos Poulantzas, whom we do not necessarily follow on all issues, provided a lapidary summary of these critiques. Quote, the petty bourgeoisie actually has, in the long run, no autonomous class political position of its own. This simply means that in a capitalist social formation, there is only the bourgeois way and the proletarian way, the socialist way. There is no such thing as the third way, which various theories of the middle class insist on. So yeah, that's a very good point. Which is also why neoliberals and people who espouse neoliberalism, people who are just like your average liberal in capitalist society, they don't have any coherent principles, which is why you can't nail them down on any issue. And if you try to, they just leave the conversation, but they don't change their mind. Um, their positions are only centered around self-interest. They have no coherent ideology whatsoever. Regarding Anderson's specific third way endorsement of Fabianism and anarchism, it is worth briefly recalling the long-standing Marxist critiques of both of these traditions. As Anderson presumably knows, Fabianism opposed the Socialist League, which was strongly supported by Engels and, quote, distinguished itself from the start by declaring anti-imperialism central to the definition of socialism in the Marxian conception. In its manifesto, the Fabian Society openly embraced imperialism and rejected the principle of the self-determination of nations, which was central to Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Okay, so yeah, basically just like the worst kind of like revisionism you could do, like apologia for imperialism. As Zach Cope explains, quote, the ideologically prominent Fabian section of the British Independent Labour Party was in the majority imperialist. Fabianism sought to weld socialism, quote, socialism, narrowly defined as a more egalitarian redistribution of Britain's wealth, to the expansionist nationalism of British imperialism. So yeah, again, that is what social democrats, democratic socialists, all the reformists, that's what they want. They don't want to end imperialism. They just want to distribute the imperial super profits more equally among the people in their own country that they consider the working class. And to hell with the actual working class who have to work in sweatshops to produce that wealth. Let's see. I'm almost at about 40 minutes. Let me see if there's any comments here. All right. Um, let's see. I'll read this last paragraph and then I'll switch over to the last book. As early as 1902, J. A. Hobson had understood the existence of, quote, Fabian imperialists, a point that Lenin emphasized as well in his critique of the, quote, social imperialists. More generally, meaning those who, like the opportunist Fabian society, were, quote, socialists in words and imperialists in deeds. Yeah, now the word is treatlerites. I'm glad that people have been updating the terms, but that's the catchy one now. Just call these people treatlerites. Moreover, Lenin's foundational critique of, quote, petty bourgeois revolutionism, which smacks of or borrows something from anarchism, not a coincidence, includes a perfect summary of Anderson's overall orientation. The petty bourgeois, is, quote, driven to frenzy by the horrors of capitalism as a social phenomenon, which, like anarchism, is characteristic of all capitalist countries. The instability of such revolutionism, its barrenness, its liability to become swiftly transformed into submission, apathy, fantasy, and even a frenzied infatuation with one or another bourgeois fad, all this is a matter of common knowledge. So yeah, this is why people have theory. This is why people suggest reading theory. It is literally the instruction manual for all of this from people who have encountered these exact scenarios before and are telling you the correct way to get through them. And so when people insist that you are too theory headed or you're like worshiping people who died a long time ago, it's like they're using excuses to stay reinventing the wheel, to stay doing the things that don't work under the guise of at least doing something, but they are doing the wrong thing. And their insistence on not reading theory is because they don't want to be told that they are doing the wrong thing by people who know better than them. Lacerda, we can see here, is clearly following in Lenin's footsteps by redeploying and updating his insightful critiques of petty bourgeois radicalism, a la Anderson. So I'm going to bookmark this one there. And now we'll pick up with The Busy Worker's Handbook to the Apocalypse. Let's see where I bookmarked it before. Okay, so we're right here. So yesterday we left off talking about the annual global emission rate from fossil fuels, and we were getting into talking about the different things that emit fossil fuels and how they're categorized. So it is estimated that from 1850 to 2020, humans emitted a cumulative 2.42 trillion tons of CO2. So 45% of that means we've added 1.09 trillion tons of CO2 to the atmosphere, where it acts as a greenhouse gas. Our annual global emissions for 2022 was 40.5 billion tons. So 45% of that is an extra 18.2 billion tons added to the atmosphere last year. This represents a 1.7 increase to the total cumulative load. If we assume constant future emissions at 2022 levels, it would increase the cumulative atmospheric load by 10% in 6 years, 15% in 9 years, 20% in 12 years, and by 25% in 15 years. The fantasy of net zero, see section 4, relies on not just decreasing emissions, but actually negative emissions to remove that cumulative load already present in the atmosphere. CO2 takes time to cause warming. Hansen writes that after 100 years, CO2 will have caused about 75% of the embedded warming, with the last 25% taking much longer as slow feedbacks fully play out. See section 6, paragraph 3 of this paper. And that's a hyperlink, so I don't know if it's actually this one or a different one. This means there is a lag between increasing CO2 concentration and observed warming. Much like putting on a blanket doesn't immediately warm you up, so the warming we observe today is the result of CO2 emissions from decades past, and the additional CO2 we're emitting today won't really take effect for decades to come. You may see other articles quoting a significantly lower figure of around 455 billion tons. The confusion here arises from whether the figure is for carbon or carbon dioxide. Obviously, CO2 has oxygen atoms that contribute weight. Some researchers focus exclusively on the carbon atom. The conversion factor for carbon to CO2 is times 3.67. The other factor is whether the figure is for fossil fuel emissions or total anthropogenic emissions, including deforestation. The two paragraphs below are excerpted from Friedlingstein et al. 2021 and should clarify the difference. And so he cites this paragraph here. So for the historical period 1850 to 2020, cumulative fossil CO2 emissions for 1850 to 2020 were 455 plus or minus 25 GTC, including the cement carbonation sink. And total anthropogenic emissions, cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions for 1850 to 2020 total 660 plus or minus 65 GTC, of which almost 70% occurred since 1960 and more than 30% since 2000. Total anthropogenic emissions more than doubled over the last, and then it cuts off there. Let's see. Methane. So now we're getting into methane and other GHGs. This is section 2.2. So, I mean, interesting so far. I guess I should comment a little bit. We're just discussing the different ways that fossil fuels are emitted, what is considered a fossil fuel, because everybody just kind of thinks of like carbon dioxide. They think of the burning of things like gas, the burning of oil from either power plants or cars, right? I think that's mostly what people think. But there's obviously these other things that go into it. And the bigger point overall is that despite whatever claims people have been making to curb environmental damage, to care about the environment, to address any of this, it has very obviously not been happening, as you can tell by the increase of emissions overall. Methane behaves very differently from CO2. It reacts readily with an average lifespan, sorry, in the atmosphere of about 12 years. What that means is that our methane emissions are actually much higher than one might think from the graphic at the start of section 2, because maintaining a constant level of methane in the atmosphere requires a constant baseline of methane emissions. And every time we raise the level of methane in the atmosphere, we have to emit even more to keep replacing the methane that is constantly being removed. So, in order to produce a steady, sustained climb like we see currently, our actual raw methane emissions have to be enormous. So, yeah, getting more to the point that, like, this is not being addressed in any meaningful way whatsoever, um, let alone actually decreased. 1 ton of methane creates about 86 times as much warming as CO2 over a 20-year period, abbreviated GWP 20 for 20-year global warming potential. That impact goes down over time, with GWP 100 at about 32 times CO2. Because human civilization is not likely to last through the next 20 years, I will use the GWP 20 as the relevant value. Hell of a claim there, too. This guy's dropping bombs as well. You may note that methane concentrations are measured in ppb rather than ppm like CO2, meaning there's much less methane in the atmosphere than CO2, so parts per billion rather than parts per million. However, we've already more than doubled this potent greenhouse gas from pre industrial. A recent study suggests that air pollution, NOx, helps knock methane out of the atmosphere. So decreasing pollution could increase the methane's lifespan and thus increase its GWP even higher. Yeah, and that's something I'd heard of before. People are saying that there's some odd feedback loops that are going to happen like when there are inevitable catastrophic consequences of climate change that result in less pollution being created, like less greenhouse gases, less fossil fuels being burned because there's literally less people because a lot of them have died off. That's actually going to warm up the planet even more because something about what is being done by humans on a day-to-day basis, like he's describing with this methane, is actually staving off some of the feedback loops of climate change. And so once people stop doing that, those will start to take effect and make things worse. We're kind of like stuck in like this catch 22. I guess the only solution would be to like gradually release, like slow things down. But that's again not being done, not even being proposed. Another major difference is the emissions sources. Methane comes primarily from wetlands, and one of the biggest concerns for future emissions increases is thawing for future emissions increases is thawing of Arctic ice and permafrost which currently contain enormous amounts of frozen methane. Yeah, as well as like unknown diseases and other things that we can't even imagine. Measurements of fossil fuel methane emissions are also highly suspect with significant underreporting. Oh, great. Great news. Methane levels have increased from a pre-industrial level of approximately 750 parts per billion to 9 to 1920 parts per billion currently. Using the GWP 20 of 86x, we can convert that to an equivalent CO2 or CO2e of about 101 parts per million. This is helpful when looking at projections from climate scientists about what happens if we double CO2. We can simply add up the observed CO2 increase and the converted CO2e from methane to get our total global warming impact. Adding 101 ppm CO2e to the observed CO2 concentration of 419 ppm gives us a current total CO2 of 520 parts per million. Okay, so pretty simple little calculation is doing there. Just saying that, like, if you factor in the methane, which people are currently not doing, just like people were doing the other statistical game, the sleight of hand of talking just about carbon rather than carbon dioxide. Once you factor in the methane, the situation is actually much worse. So there's going to be a lot of that. There's going to be a lot of this guy clarifying that things are much worse than anyone is currently talking about, even the people who are being quote unquote alarmist about this. We can do the same for other greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide and extremely potent GHG with a GWP 100 or of 298x CO2. Unlike methane, GWP 20 is not significantly different. Using approximately 260 parts per billion as the pre industrial value for N2O, we get a CO2e of 23 parts per million, putting our running total at CO2e at 543. Okay, so again, we're still getting worse. Factoring in more things, the number is climbing. Hansen writes in Global Warming in the Pipeline, quote, with all trace gases included, the increase of GHG effective forcing between 1750 and 2021 is 4.09 W over M2. Sorry for all the jargon here, folks. I just don't know what most of these things really are. If I do know, I'll try to read out what it's supposed to stand for. But anyway, which is equivalent to increasing the 1750 CO2 amount, 278 parts per million, to 561 parts per million, formulae and supporting material. We have already reached, this part is bolded here, we have already reached the GHG climate forcing level of doubled CO2. Emphasis added. So that must be the important part that he's citing about there. Again, just getting across, really hammering home the message that the climate situation is much worse than even the most alarmists are saying it is. There are several natural cycles that can enhance or moderate global warming. Leon Simons is a climate scientist who is active on Twitter and regularly posts great graphics and information, like the chart below, which can also be found in several of Hansen's updates. So this is another very wavy chart of red and blue lines describing global temperatures and factoring a lot of Ninos. So section 2.3.1, El Nino. The biggest and most immediately concerning factor is the El Nino Southern Oscillation, the ENSO. The cycle consists of a cool phase called La Nina, or an ENSO negative, when Pacific Ocean currents absorb extra heat and, circulate that heat down into the deep waters, and a warm phase called El Nino, or ENSO positive, when those currents switch and emit that stored heat energy back into the atmosphere. The last super strong El Nino cycle was in 2016, when Earth observed its warmest year in 120,000 years. Okay, so that's weird. The ocean currents actually cycle back and forth between absorbing or releasing stored up heat. And it looks like some indigenous people figured that out thousands of years ago, which is why they have the names that they have. As of March 2023, we have just entered an ENSO neutral phase after an extended cool La Nina phase with NOAA forecasting El Nino conditions by September 2023. Already indications are emerging of a possible super El Nino. Ocean temperatures are currently the hottest they've ever been. And then this is accompanied by a chart of, again, just this 45-degree angled trend line upwards of global surface temperature relative to 1880 to 1920 average. And I have another bar chart, official NOAA CPC ENSO probabilities, issued March 2023. The timing means the strong heating impacts won't arrive until after summer 2023, but summer 2024 will break records. And now that we are through summer, past summer 2024, it indeed did that. Quoting Hansen, 2024 is likely to be off the chart as the warmest year on record. Even a little futz of an El Nino, like the tropical warming in 2018 to 19, which barely qualified as an El Nino, should be sufficient for record global temperature. A classical strong El Nino in 2023 to 24 could push global temperature to about plus 1.5 degrees Celsius. Yeah. Once again, another chart, global surface temperatures. Looks like it's the same one from before. I guess just some added data here at the end. You may notice that ever since the Super El Nino of 2016, we have not had a single year below the 1970 to 2015 trend line. This is in keeping with expected accelerated warming rate discussed more in section 5.2, and represents a step change in global climate, meaning that we will not return to the green trend line. It is possible that if the coming El Nino is a strong one, that we could experience yet another step change increase. I'd have to look back at this. Now that we're in 2025, I should do some Googling later and see if the El Nino that we had in 2023 was considered a strong or just a mild one. Current ENSO numerical indicators are available from NOAA here, and nice graphics of recent trends are updated here. So those are both hyperlinks if you guys want to click through in the show notes. It is notable in the graph below that El Nino strength in 2018 to 2020 was much weaker than the 2016 Super El Nino, and yet still managed to match the global temperature level, an indication of how much the baseline had risen in only a few years. Now we have another ENSO index chart. I don't know how to effectively communicate that one in audio format, but I would just recommend clicking through in the show notes to check it out. These will also be left up on YouTube if you look up for the True Crimes of the Empire YouTube channel. The Interdecadal Pacific Oscillation, the IPO, and Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the PDO, are two very similar terms that may have specific, discrete meanings among experts, but among the lay public, and science journalists are used interchangeably. And for my purposes, it is not necessary to delve into the specifics. The short version is that the Pacific Ocean has another powerful recurring pattern besides El Nino that impacts the climate. PDO cycles typically last 10 to 30 years, much longer than a typical El Nino cycle of 2 to 7 years. The PDO recently switched to weekly positive after an to WEAK weekly positive after an unusually short negative phase. I'm not going to attempt to provide a forecast, but I would say within the next year we will probably see a clearer signal of where this cycle is going. Another thing, if anybody wants to Google, we could check and see if the PDO is now in a positive after a short negative phase, or if that was like some kind of misindication. Another chart of that PDO index. So there's red spikes followed by blue valleys, basically. So now on to section 2.3.3. Just going to go for about 3 more minutes here. The solar cycle is this section is the solar cycle. The solar cycle is a regular and predictable 11-year cycle of sunspot activity related to the reversal of the sun's polarity. The intensity can vary significantly, and the current cycle is already far exceeding predicted activity levels, with 2 years still to go before it reaches its maximum. On March 13th, Helio observers recorded a very strong coronal mass ejection, a CME, on the scale of the Carrington event, which luckily was aimed away from Earth. Simons has stated a strong solar maximum could cause 0.2 degrees Celsius of temporary global warming over the next few years. So an entirely other factor is just like extra heat from the sun, coronal mass ejection. Section 2.4 is Arctic ice. The Arctic ice cap has steadily dwindled in size and thickness to the point we are now looking at our first ice-free Arctic summer. Minimum Arctic ice is observed in September, within the next few years, commonly referred to as a blue ocean event. When this occurs, it will be an extremely important warming factor for 2 reasons. First is the change in albedo, which simply means reflectivity. Ice reflects about 80% of incoming solar radiation, while ocean water reflects only about 10%. The second is latent heat of melting. The same amount of solar heat energy required to melt 1 pound of ice will raise the temperature of 1 pound of liquid water by 176 degrees Fahrenheit or 80 degrees Celsius. That is an insane amount of energy currently being stored as latent heat, which after a BOE will directly translate into warmer Arctic winter. So that's another crazy feedback loop I didn't know about. The fact that ice reflects more heat back into the atmosphere, whereas the water absorbs it and absorbs it by that much. But this is also why people are so intent on opening up shipping lanes in the Arctic. They're worried about Greenland because a lot of that is not going to be icy anymore very soon, if it already isn't. And those are going to be viable shipping lanes that people will want to use for profits. So, all right, I'm just going to bookmark it here. Uh, I know I'm only at 59 minutes, but I'm doing that because I get an hour of this cool little noise cancellation program that makes my voice sound better and hopefully blocks out all the background noise. So hopefully let me know if this one was better than yesterday, because I didn't have it yesterday, but it only gives me an hour a day, but it's usually all I need. All right. Thank you guys for joining. I appreciate you guys doing it. I will see you again tomorrow. And again, the links to all these documents